the parallel that, as I've been researching both this Egypt situation and the story of and what's going on in Russia, to a certain extent, and maybe less so with Russia, but there are situations where we have very little leverage. And once it's clear that as in terms of our foreign policy, we do not have, as a government, as a U.S. government, leverage, the question then becomes, what do we do which may not impact the specific issue at hand, but will have broader implications for our foreign policy? That, I think, is a far more apt description in some respects in terms of Egypt than it will be in terms of Russia. But and I think that'll be clear as we talk about it. As of this morning, the death toll, as reported by the health ministry in Egypt, is at 525, injured at over 3,500. These are government numbers. They very well may be higher. The Muslim Brotherhood is putting out numbers that are a multiple of 3 of those, really, or maybe more. The death toll the Muslim Brotherhood is putting out is 2,600, injured at around 10,000. It's very difficult to say. There has been violence, and actually greater violence outside of even Cairo, around the country. Just to recap, 6 weeks ago, and we spoke to Juan Cole about this, and it's worth going back and listening to that interview if you didn't have a chance at that time. Juan Cole's perception, and he had been in Egypt at the time, or at least in the weeks leading up to the coup, which is looking more now in hindsight as a coup, I think, than it was as it was happening in some respects. There was massive popular resistance to the Morsi government. What factors were driving that, I think Juan Cole laid out quite well. I think it was a combination of things. Clearly the military and the police force was very anti-Muslim Brotherhood in some respects. And I think it's also clear that to a certain extent, at the very least, elements of the military, if not the military writ large, was waiting and probably priming the pump. But there were millions of people who had popular resistance to Morsi. It is now clear that the military made a decision yesterday or the day before to basically destroy or attempt to destroy the Muslim Brotherhood. We mentioned yesterday that Mohammed al-Baradi, who was the Nobel Prize winning, I guess, interim vice president, resigned yesterday, left the government that is run by the General Sisi. Sisi. And not exactly the name that you would anticipate for a autocratic dictator. I'm sorry.
Maybe
folks.
Exactly the name.
Yes. This story from Reuters, and you know, at this point, it seems to me that I would imagine many governments are scrambling. But from Reuters yesterday, Western allies warned Egypt's military leaders right up to the last minute against using force to crush protest sit-ins by supporter of the ousted Islamist president Mohamed Morsi. We had a political plan that was on the table that had been accepted by the other side. He was speaking of the Muslim Brotherhood, said the EU envoy Bernardino Leon, who co-led the mediation effort with the U.S. Deputy Secretary of State William Burns. They could have taken this option, so all that has happened today was unnecessary. Some of the toughest U.S. messages were delivered personally to Sisi in almost daily telephone calls from Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel. Now, understand, we give about $1.5 billion annually in economic aid, which goes primarily to the military. Much of that, though certainly not all of it, and I'm not quite sure exactly what the breakdown is, of course, aid to the military, which then basically comes in services in kind. We're going to give you $1.5 billion in aid. Some of it will be cash. Some of it will be weapons that we're going to use that money to buy from U.S. defense contractors. And then, of course, we'll ship it to you, to Egypt.
And it's just important to add, too, that, you know, like the Egyptian military owns like hotels and resorts. They're in
much
every
of the
single
economy,
part of the economy.
Many
there.
of the industries are literally run by the Egyptian army, and that's been the case for quite some time. They are a much broader institution, I guess you could say, than just being the military. Sisi and the hardline Interior Minister Mohammed Ibrahim, according to the Reuters story, were explicitly warned that al-Baradei would resign if they chose force over negotiation, supposedly robbing the military of its principal source of liberal civilian respectability. The hardliners have remarkable ability to ignore reality, said an anonymous source who was involved in the diplomatic exchanges. The Egyptian military source said public outrage. The same source was an Egyptian military source, said public outrage after critical comments by visiting U.S. Senators John McCain and Lindsey Graham last week, and leaked reports of a possible deal between the authorities and the Brotherhood had put the army in a tough position. This is obviously some spin that is coming from the Egyptian military, to the extent that the hardliners in the Egyptian military believe this stuff. We can't know, but to the extent that they're using it as an excuse is relevant. And so congratulations, Lindsey Graham and John McCain, for at least injecting yourselves into this. You should be sitting in your offices right now sending apology notes to just about every member of Egyptian society at this point. I don't know how much the military was boxed in by these things, but at the very least, they're using it for propaganda purposes. Once again, the U.S. government provides $1.5 billion in aid to the Egyptian military. You should know that Arab nations had lined up 6 weeks ago to provide $12 billion of aid in the event that the U.S. government, in addition to actually providing a lot of that aid, but they were willing to supplement and were willing, not only were willing, but did. They opened up a lot of the market reserves. We had talked about that with Juan Cole. They were willing to basically replace that U.S. aid. Now, with that said, President Obama came out today and gave a press conference with the U.S. reaction, and it was, I think, anemic is a pretty good description. He basically said we need the will of the Egyptian people to be listened to. We deplore this violence. And as such, we're going to show how much we deplore it by canceling a joint military exercise with the Egyptian military. No word yet on a response from the Egyptian military, but one can imagine it's, thanks, we're pretty tied up right now anyways with our own exercises with live rounds.
Yeah, we're pretty active at the moment.
That's right.
I could tell you what like Frank Gaffney and Glenn Beck heard Obama say, though.
What was that?
They heard him say, to my brothers in the Muslim Brotherhood, fight the infidels.
Right, of
Allah,
course.
Akbar.
Of course. Of course. And, but they're largely irrelevant players in this, I think. You know, the idea that President Obama is afraid of, in some ways, being seen as being pro-Muslim Brotherhood, I think is probably low on the list of their calculations. The real issue here is that it is quite clear that that $1.5 billion is not buying us a lot of leverage with the Egyptian military. And to the extent that we had built up relationships by training most of their leadership, it's quite clear that we don't have the leverage necessary to impact the outcome of anything on the short term in Egypt. And there's been, as far as I can tell, close to a near universal call by people who are experts in this region to cut off funding now. At the very least, to say we need to do a serious policy review. We're going to cut off a portion of our funding, and we're going to review the rest going forward, because while we may not be able to impact events on the ground in Egypt in the short term or the midterm, the question is what signal are we sending to the broader region and to people on the ground in the broader region? Will we tolerate massacres of 500, 1,000, 2,000 people? Now, it seems clear that President Obama has the authority to, at the very least, suspend this military aid. And I don't know. This is one of those situations where we really can't impact it. All we can do is send a message to the broader region.
I disagree a little bit.
Well, cut off his mic.
Well,
Do tell.
Well, I think, first of all, in terms of the message to the broader region, it's not as pivotal a country as Egypt, but we've been supporting Bahrain through their crackdown for like the past couple years, basically. And I think the other thing with Egypt, where we exert our leverage, is much more vis-a-vis their policy to Israel, which didn't really change under the Muslim Brotherhood and won't change under the military. So we're like picking and choosing where we actually have pressure points with them, and that's not primarily on human rights and these types of issues. Those are secondary. So I think the real issue is the peace agreement with Israel and the broader like strategic interests that we perceive there. And that's been pretty continuous, actually, amongst both sides, whether the Brotherhood or the military.
So your point is that to the extent that we have leverage, it is in a very compartmentalized, which is not to negate the
unilaterally stepped out of the peace arrangement with Israel, as an example, or radically changed the flow of goods to Gaza, you might see a much more aggressive set of actions taken. And we might also see
but that also
us
begs the
calling
question
the
as
Gulf
to whether
states
or not,
and saying, actually, we have a problem with you buffering this.
Yes, I mean, but is it necessarily in the interests of the military to change course in terms of the relationships with Israel?
Oh, it's not at all. I'm not saying I'm getting just really specific to what we have leverage over. I don't think it's in Egypt's interest to back out of peace with Israel. I'm saying that the pressure points we choose that we do have, and when we choose to exert are not about human rights in Egypt, and that's been clear for a long time.
Yeah, well, I mean, it certainly belies what we've been saying publicly, and that hypocrisy, I think, is becoming all too clear. And so, and if the implication is it's not in Egypt's interest necessarily to take a more aggressive posture with Israel, then the value, the opportunity cost of trying to exercise that leverage with the military aid is not so great. In other words, we pull that. We're not necessarily, that may be what we use our leverage for, but we may not necessarily need that leverage
No, exactly.
in the way that we need
because there's no incentive amongst anybody really in any type of rational position in the Egyptian in any part of Egyptian political leadership to shift that, including a lot of people in the Muslim Brotherhood. You know, nothing really changed as far as those dynamics went. So I think we do have some pressure points. We're just not going to use them for human rights, basically.
Perhaps. I mean, but I don't know that. I mean, I guess. I mean, I see what you're saying here. Is it? But
when we pulled the plug on Mubarak, the Gulf states were enraged, but they had to deal with it. This is a situation where we haven't gone around to them and pulled our own aid out. And I'm not saying it would change the situation. I'm saying we do have more ability to project influence there, but we're not going to choose to do it for this type of issue. That's what my assessment would be.
All right. I mean, that's even a more depressing assessment in some respects, and perhaps maybe cynicism is warranted. As Michael sits over there in his cynicism corner.
Egypt and America, there's cynicism. Makes sense.
All right. Fair enough.